Thank you.
All right.
Better over here.
That's fine. All right. Let us turn to Zechariah 12.
Are we still in Zechariah?
We are still progressing rapidly towards the end.
Okay, I'm joking.
Ha ha ha. Now, I put up on the screen the timeline, and the reason why I think it's important is that this is what we're teaching, what we're going through, what we're studying is really quite complex. It involves a lot of information over a long period of time and a lot of events and a lot of things happening. If you remember, and I'll kind of point out where we are as we go into the last part of this chapter. If you remember last week, I mentioned to you as we discussed this chapter, which involves the Battle of Jerusalem, this future Battle of Jerusalem, I went through and gave you the three major battles, which are not the Battle of Jerusalem. But I decided to give you the three other major ones because I want you to see kind of how they fit. Now, and I'll just review this very quickly. We have, first of all, in this time frame, and we don't know exactly, probably it's going to be in the time just before the 7-year tribulation period. There's going to be this battle we call the Psalm 83 War. And of course, as I said last week, it has a particular Arab coalition. Their purpose, it's stated in verse 12 of that psalm, is to expel or annihilate Israel and to install an Arab state in their place. It's very clear in verse 12. I went through the Old Testament names and then gave you the current geopolitical countries or areas that are involved. You will see from looking at them you maybe don't have the former outline before you, but when you look at all these, you realize that this has never happened before. There has not been this particular coalition that's ever invaded Israel. So it obviously has to be a battle that's going to come. Now, this attack is defeated by the Israeli military, and as I told you, the time frame is sometime probably just before in surrounding this time that we call the 7-year tribulation period. Then we have the Ezekiel 38 war. This is a mixed confederacy which seems to include the area of Western Russia or the Ukraine area. It definitely involves Iran. It involves the northern part of Sudan, Libya, and probably Turkey, and especially because of the word that's used in the Old Testament, especially the eastern part of Turkey. Now, the motive of this invasion is to capture the natural resources of Israel. And, of course, we see here in verse 12 that there's agricultural resources, energy, and silver and gold that they're after. Now, this battle is different than the first one because God supernaturally defends Israel and defeats this invasion as seen in verses 19 through 22 of Ezekiel 38. Hailstones come down of enormous size, and there's an annihilation of these troops that invade. This is not an invasion that is overcome by the Israeli army by itself. Then we have this third battle, which, of course, is probably the most famous and the one that you're most familiar with. This one occurs at the very end of the 7-year tribulation period, quote, Armageddon. Everybody knows the word Armageddon. Even the most illiterate person in the Bible knows the word Armageddon, okay? Of course, this is... it's right. He
actually looked at me.
It's coming this way.
So I'm sure they should disclose
This is an invasion of a diverse international coalition which is specifically led by the Antichrist. Again, this is a supernaturally won battle and is specifically led by Messiah. and his angelic forces. And of course, we read about this battle in the 19th chapter of the book of Revelation. Okay?
So international coalition, the Antichrist,
is the head of it.
Against Messiah and his.
Yes.
And his.
Yes.
Angelic.
And his angelic army. So, he got, and in this battle, as we read in Revelation 19, he wins, the Messiah comes, he wins the battle with his angelic army, he captures the false prophet, he captures the Antichrist, and locks them up. And, it's their temporary end. It's
Revelation
their 19. It's their end for 1,000 years. They're not allowed out for 1,000 years' time, which of course we call the millennial reign of Christ. Okay, they have no presence on the earth during that time. Now, also, I want to mention here, starting in your outline tonight, and let's read first verses. Let's read 4 through, especially 4 through 8 or 9 to start out here in Zechariah 12. Again, notice the phrase that occurs 7 times in this passage. In that day, starting verse 4, declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with bewilderment, and his rider with madness. But I will watch over the house of Judah while I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. Then the clans of Judah will say in their hearts, a strong support for us are the inhabitants of Jerusalem through the Lord of hosts, their God. Here's the word again, the angelic army, the Lord of hosts, the Tesaba army. Verse 6, in that day, again, reiterated, I will make the clans of Judah like a fire pot among pieces of wood, and a flaming torch among sheaths. So they will consume on the right hand and on the left hand all the surrounding peoples, while the inhabitants of Jerusalem again dwell in their own sites in Jerusalem. Verse 7, the Lord also will save the tents of Judah first, in order that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not be magnified above Judah. Verse 8, again, in that day, the Lord will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the one who is feeble among them in that day will be like David. And the house of David will be like God himself, like the angel of the Lord before them. And it will come about in that day that I will set about to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. Okay? So, let's try to break this down and make some sense of it. Now, as I said last week, this word, a cup of reeling. Remember it says here in verse 3, actually verses 2 and 3, behold, I'm going to make Jerusalem like a cup that causes reeling. In other words, passionate intoxication and instability. So, he's destabilizing the armies of the nations that come into Jerusalem. He's drawing them in. They are unable to resist being drawn in at this time. And they will have this irrational, passionate hatred of Israel, which will draw them there. Okay? And will end up, of course, ultimately being their doom. And again, in verse 3, it will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone, and all the peoples who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. Now, it doesn't mean all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it, that every nation and every army would be gathered against it, but it means that there will be an international coalition that will be gathered against it. Now, I want to make a little bit more sense of this, and let me mention, go to, in your outline tonight, go to under review C, and that is at the midpoint of the tribulation. Of course, we know in 2 Thessalonians that Antichrist will be revealed. It will become obvious who he is. Why will it become obvious who he is? We've been over this.
Because he goes into the temple and the abomination of desolation.
He commits the abomination of desolation, just like his predecessor, 500 years before almost did, Antiochus Epiphanes, who did the very same thing. Antichrist will do it again. And of course, then this treaty that he enacts, a peace treaty for Israel that begins the tribulation period, that gives them peace for 3.5 years, will be broken. This will lead to him beginning to persecute Israel, and his coalition will begin to surround it. And you say, why is it that you know that his coalition at this time will begin to surround it? And you find the answer to that. You don't have to turn if you don't want to, but you'll find the answer in Revelation 11. Let me read it to you. He's talking about measuring the temple in this. And in verse 2, and he says, leave out measuring the court which is outside the temple, because this is the court of the Gentiles. This is what it's called, okay? And he says, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. Okay? So what happens at the 3.5 year period is that there is an invasion, but it's not an invasion apparently that's a sudden invasion, but it's a buildup of troops of the nations in and around Israel. Okay? These are the Antichrist troops. Okay? That will culminate at the end of the 3.5 year period with this battle we call the Battle of Jerusalem that we're studying. Alright? So I put up the timeline to try to help you understand this. Now, Nehemiah, of course, who is... my wife will kill me if I don't do it this way.
It doesn't matter because you block it in.
Okay. Well, I block it for you. All right, because I can't get out of the way entirely. But
We can see it fine.
Nehemiah, of course, is about, his timeline is about here. He's about 520 BC. He's being given this prophecy. And of course, this prophecy is also included in Daniel's great prophecy of Daniel 9 that we've gone over. Remember verses 24 through 27. This is the 70 weeks of years prophecy. It begins a little bit before this with the Babylonian kingdom. It extends over a period of 69 weeks of years. It culminates at the end of the 69 weeks of years in approximately, some people, we'll say April 6, 33. Some people say it's March, whatever, of 32. At any rate, at that point, it says that Messiah the Prince will be revealed. Messiah the Prince will be revealed at the end of that 69 weeks of years. In the Gospels, what occurs? We've been over this. An event occurs.
Entering the city
Yes.
of Jerusalem.
Right. He enters the city during the beginning of Passover week. Okay, they sing this famous Psalm 118, okay, about Messiah the King. They sing it. Of course, it's prophesied by the prophets that he would show up on the foal of a donkey. All right. He rides indeed a donkey in. In the Gospels, he tells the disciples to go get this donkey. He rides it into the city on exactly that day. Now, the interesting thing, and I'm going to go in this a little bit later, but I find, and sometime I should do this, I didn't have time to do it. It'd be interesting to go through the prophets and to make a list of all of the prophecies that describe Messiah. What his ministry would be, what his temperament would be, when he would come, okay, and be announced as Messiah the King, what he would do, what his ministry would be like, how he would die, how it would occur, how would he be buried. There are, I'm certain if I made a list, there would probably easily be 100 of these things. Very specific prophecies through all the different prophets about Messiah the King, Messiah the Prince, the Messiah. Now, the interesting thing is, despite all of these, even to the point of being told that he would be described as Messiah the King, despite that, what happens when that occurs? Within a day or two, well, literally, not even that long, okay, the Pharisees conspire and enact a plan because they say, we're getting rid of this guy. And the Jews, as a nation, agree. So in 5 days' time, he goes from being announced Messiah the King to being on a cross. Okay? They reject their Messiah. Now, don't know this because you're going to see here in the verses we're going to tonight, there's going to be a very fantastic event that's going to occur. And I'll show you what that is. The culmination.
There's 44
44? Okay. You know, they had
Or what?
prophecies of Jesus Christ.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
They had no small amount of information about who he would be and what he would do. Yes.
Do you think Jews really saw Messiah as Messiah back then?
No, they didn't.
So they just were...
They were blind. They didn't accept him. They wouldn't accept him, even though it was clear, like Joe said, 44 different separate prophecies all about him and what he would do, when he would come, and all these things. They rejected their Messiah.
But you said that they admitted that he was the king, he was the Messiah.
Very temporarily. Real temporarily. Okay? Now, yes.
Wasn't that his plan all
Yes.
along?
Yes.
So I mean, it's very relevant, but it really isn't relevant.
Yes.
Because it's already been...
It was in the
The
cards.
whole thing,
It was in the cards. Okay? But the interesting thing is, because they reject him, okay, then Jesus says in Matthew 24, on this talk he gives on the Mount of Beatitudes, okay, because the disciples say, well, what will be your second coming, what will be like when you come back? And he goes into this 24th chapter of Matthew, which we know is this famous chapter about the end time and the events about this. And he says, at the beginning of this talk in Matthew 24, look at this temple here that you admire. Soon there will not be one stone standing on top of another. The temple that they so admired and that they swore oaths to, and it was literally became an idol for them. In literally 38 years from the day he said this, approximately 38 years, the Romans would come. They would lay siege over a 3-year period in Jerusalem and eventually take the city, killing over 1.1 million Jews in the process. The Bible makes it clear the reason why it happened, because they rejected their Messiah. And there was a judgment upon them that would last for over 1,900 years. They would be dispersed all over the world, which we know occurred until this miracle of 1948 occurs, okay? And that they're regathered again. So then we see the events, of course, of this last week, the 70th week of Daniel, which, of course, involves this thing, a whole bunch of other things. And we're talking about some of these events, some of these battles that are probably somewhere right before here, just before the beginning of that 70th week. So I'm trying to try to fit it into a timeline for you to try to understand it better. Now, let's go over verses 4 through 9. It says here in 4. I'm in the wrong book here. Back to Zechariah 12. It says, in that day declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with bewilderment, the rider with madness. I will watch over the house of Judah, and I will strike every horse of the peoples, that is, this invading army, with blindness. So, the invading armies, I'm going to interpret for you, their transportation systems, their communication systems will become confused. How will they become confused? Not because of a technological issue per se, because the Lord of hosts will confuse it. Okay? And of course, their troops will experience bewilderment. The word bewilderment in Hebrew means a supernatural confusion and panic. He will literally create among these troops an absolute panic. Okay? They will not be organized. They will be extraordinarily disorganized at this point. They also will be, quote, blinded. That is, they will become incapable of employing their mission and their strategy. Doesn't necessarily mean that they won't be able to see out of their eyes, but in terms of their ability to see the mission and to enact that, it'll be completely confused for them. Yes, Jack?
It's almost like a repeat of the Six-Day War.
Almost.
Where they were
But even worse.
even worse. It sounds familiar.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, the miracle of the 6-day war.
Now, was it also some time in the Old Testament when God intervened supernaturally and they killed each other in their camp?
Well, we're going to look at one of those. And why don't you go ahead and turn to 2 Kings 6, starting verse 15, because it's good you point that out. Now, notice the next verse. The leaders of Jerusalem will see this going on, and they will recognize this is a supernatural effect caused by God's angelic army. They're going to realize we're not really doing this. God obviously is supernaturally doing this. So go to 2 Kings 6, and we're going to, like you said, we're going to show you an example of this type of thing having happened in the past, where God very strongly supernaturally intervenes. Should be starting in verse 15. So there's this encampment of these troops against Israel. A large number of them, as a matter of fact. And this attendant of this prophet Elisha, his buddy, it says, now when the attendant of the man of God, that's Elisha, had risen early and gone out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was circling the city. And this isn't Jerusalem, this is another city. He says, and his servant said to him, alas, my master, what shall we do? So he answered, don't fear. Elisha says, don't fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Then Elisha prayed, and he said, O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. Isn't it interesting? Mm-hmm. He now changes, literally, I put it in scientific terms, the hyperdimensional space and lets him see a hyperdimensional element that's going on. It's called the angelic army. And he says, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was filled full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And when they came down to him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, strike the people with blindness. Isn't it interesting? Again, blindness. A reiteration of what occurs here in this battle in Jerusalem. Strike them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. So, this has happened before. God has intervened in this way, and he's going to do it again here in this battle of Jerusalem. Now, it says, makes a very interesting reference here. It says, in that day, verse 6, I will make the clans of Judah like a fire pot among pieces of wood and a flaming torch among sheaves. What are sheaves?
Grain.
Bundles tied up with grain. Okay?
Yeah, we saw that in Joseph's
Dream.
Dream.
Yeah, right. The sheaves that bow down to his sheath, quote unquote. So and it says they'll consume on the right hand and on the left hand according to the peoples, while the inhabitants of Jerusalem may dwell in their own sites in Jerusalem. This is a reference, an allusion to another thing that the Jews knew very well. When you talk about these sheaves of fire, they're going to remember, being students of the Old Testament. So turn to Judges 15. This is a story about Samson.
Yeah.
He gets pretty mad at them for messing around with his wife. This man messing around with his wife. So it's, Judges 15.
Tied the fox's tails together.
Yes, that's what happens. So let's read it. In 15,
Dramatic story.
he enacts a punishment against them for doing this. Starting verse 1. But after a while, in the time of the wheat harvest, came about that Samson visited his wife with a young goat, apparently an offering. Wouldn't that entice you? A young goat. Look at this.
Forget it, honey.
Look how wonderful this smells, okay? Yeah, that's right. That's right. And he says, I will go into my wife in her room. So he plans on having an intimate connection with her. And her father did not let him enter the room. And her father said, I really thought that you had hated her intensely, so I gave her to your companion.
Oh, nice.
So he gives his wife away, okay? So she is not her younger sister more beautiful than she. In other words, you can have her as your wife. Please let her be yours instead. Samson then said to them, this time I shall be blameless. He uses blameless. Put blameless in quotes here, okay? He's creating kind of an indirect judgment against them, but nonetheless a judgment. He says, this time I'll be blameless in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. And Samson went out and caught 300 foxes and took torches, fire pots, torches, and he says, and he turned the foxes tail to tail and put one torch or fire pot in the middle between the tails. Okay? Verse 5, when he had set fire to the torches, he released the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines, thus burning up both the shocks, that is the sheaves, and the standing grain, along with the vineyards and groves. So he burns down their whole field, okay, as a result of this unique tying the foxes, and they run around, obviously, in an erratic way with these fire pots tied into their tails, okay? Sets the whole place on fire.
Animal cruelty.
Yes, the animal cruelty people would arrest him on this one.
Right.
But this is what's being referred to here by these pots of fire that burn down the sheaves. And he's saying in the same way, these troops that invade will incur this kind of, quote, fire against them. So back to Zechariah. Get back there myself. Chapter 12. Matter of fact, you might want to turn also, if you're back in there to Obadiah. I always have a hard time finding Obadiah because he's pretty short.
I was going to say, where is he?
Yeah, he's
Before Micah.
just before
Before Jonah.
Yeah, he's only two.
After Amos.
Oh, there he is.
After
I
Amos.
found it.
So
All right. Obadiah, what?
I always
Only
go over.
one, there's only one.
Oh, well, I don't know.
There's only verses. Okay,
Okay.
so it's Obadiah, and it's verse 18.
You can see I know nothing about this one.
So here's another reference to this in verse 18 of Obadiah. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau, that is their enemy, Esau, will be a stubble, in other words, a sheaves, okay? And they will set them on fire and consume them. For there will be no survivor of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. So in the same way that Esau was judged, also these invading troops will be judged in a similar way.
Since they didn't have cell phones back then, how the heck did they communicate all this?
Communicate
Yeah,
which part?
flip phones.
Each one of these different
I
books
don't
that
know.
you're going back
That's
and
why I
forth.
still use
Oh,
As far as the prophecy.
yeah. Well, that's called the Holy Spirit. You know?
Seriously?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what
As
do you
we
think,
said,
like flags
you know,
or something?
Well, yeah, how do they communicate?
That's
back
when you don't
then?
want to leave a message, but
Again, 66 books, 40 different authors over a period of over 1,500 years of time. It's a remarkable integrated story. This is why whenever you find something and you say, what does this mean? If you will look, you will find its interpretation somewhere also. It's the absolutely remarkable thing about this Bible. It's why it's a divine book. It's divinely designed. It couldn't be designed by, the coordination of 40 different authors over a period, writing 66 books over 50. Either that or they had to live an awful long time and communicate awful well with each
And they
other.
pretty much all said the same thing.
They did, and they said the themes are the same, but it's interesting how all the details are different, but all the details fit together in a remarkable way. So it also says here, in going on in verse 7, going on into 7 and 8, it says, the Lord also will save the tents of Judah first in order that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not be magnified above Judah. So he talks about the glory of David. And what does it remind you of? What comes to your mind about the glory of David? A story.
Was there a news sheet for tonight?
Apparently you didn't get it then. Okay. Sorry about that.
Initiative has 8 of them.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Really?
Yes, there was an outline.
One for each arm.
Right.
There we go. Sorry.
I was traveling fine with last week.
You were saying, what's he talking about? That's very good. Yeah. You're trying to figure out based on last week's outline. That's a stretch.
I'm so sorry.
She said she was doing pretty good
Okay.
for a while there.
Well, last
Yeah.
week goes 1 through 3, and I ran out of
Yeah.
verses.
That's right. You sure did. So again, it'll be like the house of David. What's the most famous story you can think of about the house of David?
Bathsheba.
Well, that's the negative story, but in relationship to this context.
Oh.
Jesus came from the
David and Goliath.
David and Goliath.
Uh-huh.
Here's another supernatural activity. David,
That's what we had.
this young man gets these 5 smooth stones. Okay, nobody can conquer Goliath. He is a Gibarim. Okay, he has some fellows also. We find out there's actually at least 4 more with him. At least 4 more of his size. We estimate probably at this time they were probably at least 9 or 10 feet tall, maybe a little bit taller. It talks about in the story about how big this guy's his spear was. It was, it says as big as a weaver's beam. Can you imagine? His spear around was this big. This guy is enormous. He terrifies all the army of Israel. And David says, the Lord says, you're done. And supernaturally guides the stone with a sling, hits him exactly in the place that he needs to be hit, okay, and kills him in one shot. It's a miracle. And yet it's the miracle that God enacted in the same way. Okay? Now, so again, we see this supernatural empowering that God does that He's going to do with this angel army. I want you to remember, to kind of tie this together, turn back to Zechariah 1. We've been weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks now, actually months and months in Zechariah. But I want you to go back and see how this all fits. Back in Zechariah 1, let me read again 8 through 15. It's the very beginning of this. Remember, he's going to talk about this night where he has 8 visions. He says, I saw at night, and behold, a man was riding a red horse. He's standing among these myrtle trees, which were in the ravine, with red sorrel and white horses behind him. So this man in red, who, as we went through this, is Messiah, and he has these other angelic beings on these other horses with him. And he said, my Lord, what are these? And the angel who was speaking with me said, I will show you what these are. Verse 10, the man who was standing among the myrtle trees answered and said, these are those whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth, God's angelic army. So they answered the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees and said, we have patrolled the earth. And at this point, not in the chapter we're in, but at this point it says, and all the earth was peaceful and quiet. But it gets real unquiet pretty quickly. And we're in the unquiet part in chapters 12, 13, and 14. And then notice verse 12. The angel of the Lord answered and said, O Lord of hosts, how long will you have no compassion for Jerusalem? Remember it right away. The focus is on Jerusalem, the very beginning of this prophet. And the cities of Judah, which thou hast seen, thou hast been indignant these 70 years. And the Lord answered, and the angel was speaking with them with gracious words and comforting words. So the angel who was speaking to me said to me, proclaim, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, I am exceedingly jealous for Jerusalem. Well, we see the culmination of this in what we're studying now in chapter 12. It's all about the angel army eventually ending up in Jerusalem and enacting this battle against these invading troops. Now, interestingly enough, let me just go back to chapter 12. He says, the Lord also will save the tents of Judah first, in order that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not be magnified above Judah. So, in other words, in this surrounding army, he's going to first eliminate this army in Judah, in the southern part of Israel. Okay, Jerusalem is in that southern part. But he's going to eliminate and neutralize those first. Then he's going to go and neutralize these troops effectively in Jerusalem. It says the reason why is so that the people in the rest of the country will not think that there's a special activity of God that's only for Jerusalem. It's for Judah also. That's what he's saying in this verse. All of them will be included in this victory. Okay? Now, let's go to verses 10 through 14, and we'll try to finish up this chapter. Let me read it. And I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look on whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. And they will weep bitterly over him, like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. In that day, there's another reiteration, in that day, there will be great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. And in the land will mourn, every family by itself, the family of the house of David by itself, and their wives by themselves, and the family of the house of Nathan, who I believe is the prophet Nathan, my opinion, by itself, and their wives by themselves, and the family of the house of Levi, okay, that is the priestly group, by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the Shemites by itself, and their wives by themselves, and all the families that remain, every family by itself, and their wives by themselves. Now, verse 10 is one of the most remarkable verses that we've read, and one of the most remarkable verses of the Bible, and one of the most remarkable verses in all prophecy. So mark it that way. Why is it so remarkable? What does it say that happens?
It's quoted in Acts about Holy Spirit.
Keep going.
Going where?
They finally acknowledge Christ.
Right. Israel finally accepts Messiah. Israel finally accepts Jesus as Messiah. That's what verse 10 says.
As he was pierced.
Exactly. They recognize that the person they put to death on a cross and thought they got rid of, they now finally, the blinders come off their eyes. 2,000 years of spiritual blinding comes off their eyes, and they finally realize, oh my goodness, that man who we put to death on a cross and our leaders conspired against, he is the Christ. He is the Messiah. He is our Messiah. The unbelieving Israel finally has its day of finally believing.
Okay, given that statement, why aren't they that way today?
Because their eyes are still blinded. This event,
Okay, go ahead.
remember, 7 reiterations, and in that day, in other words, it speaks of special days. Okay? They're predetermined days. And one of these predetermined days is that day when they're literally fighting off an invasion of these nations' troops coming into Jerusalem. And they finally realize, as they see the Lord supernaturally empowering them and supernaturally attacking these troops, they finally recognize this is the man, Jesus, called the Messiah. It is one of the great events of Jewish history in verse 10.
Then why did they go back? Why did they just, okay, yes, we believe, tomorrow, no, we don't?
They don't go back. From this point on, they believe.
This is still future.
It's future.
It's the Battle of Jerusalem that occurs right after the Battle of Armageddon in the future. This day has not come.
Correct word is future.
Agnostic Israel, unbelieving Israel,
Okay.
exactly. Agnostic Israel, who's, think of, again, you pointed out well, Norm, try to talk to a Jewish person about Christ. What are you going to get? You're going to get a very bristly defensive reaction. They're going to talk about the Crusades. They're going to talk about what these great German Christian people did in slaughtering 6 million of them. They're going to talk about the history of their persecution since 70 A.D. They're going to talk about their persecution by every nation from Portugal to Russia from the 12th to the 19th century. They're going to talk about all these things by the Christians. Now, is it really done by serious Christians? Of course not. But from their standpoint, these are Christians. Okay? And
I think in terms of your description there, it's very, 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 very valid. But then again, I think you have to kind of divide it between the Orthodox and then I don't want to say negatively, the non-believing Jew, but there's such a variety if you have them. If you understand where I'm going with that?
yeah, there's a diversity.
There's quite a diversity.
Yeah. The Orthodox are the believing component, but they're believing in the prophets, they're believing in their teaching, but they're not believing in Messiah yet. The Orthodox do not accept Messiah. Okay? They say He's coming. They always say He's coming. From the day that the Seder feast, first Seder feast started in Passover, and they had that dinner while still slaves in Egypt, and God told them how to have the dinner and what to eat, and the lamb was to be slain. And from that day, they have practiced that for thousands of years because they're looking to Elijah. They keep this empty seat on the Seder open because they say maybe this year He's coming, because they know if Elijah shows up, Messiah's showing up too. Okay? Well, when does Elijah show up? When does Elijah show up?
John the Baptist.
Yeah. Well,
What did you say?
In Revelation, well, those 3 guys.
no. In Revelation, those
2 guys.
2 guys.
Well, Moses.
Moses and Elijah, the 2 prophets, they show up at the beginning of this peace treaty that Antichrist has. Okay, well, I'll read it to you.
Where are you going, Revelation?
Yeah, I'll just read. It's in the 11th chapter, I believe, of Revelation. Let me read it so we... Yeah. It's verses 5 and 6 of chapter. I'll just read it to you. Chapter 11. He says, "And if anyone desires to harm these 2, fire proceeds out of their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone would desire to harm them in this manner, they will be killed. These have the power to shut up the sky in order that rain might not fall during the days of their prophesying." Who was the famous person who did that miracle? Elijah. Okay? "And they have power to turn the waters, to turn them into blood, and to smite the earth with every plague as often as they desire." Who famously did that? Moses. Okay? For 3.5 years, these guys protect Israel. Antichrist is made miserable by these guys, and every enemy of Israel is made miserable by these guys, and these surrounding troops that are moving in onto Israel during this time, okay, are made miserable because of the supernatural ability of them. Okay? They protect Israel. Now they have this, quote, peace treaty, but still, the real protection is these guys. Okay? There. So, and one of them is Elijah. And 3.5 years after he shows up, who shows up?
Jesus.
Messiah. Okay? In the middle of this battle of Jerusalem. Now, let's look at this. Let's go back to our references and make sense of this. Go to John 19. I want to read this carefully so you understand how this fits. It's very important. John 19. And we're going to start in verse 30. Here's this passage. You there? Okay.
Okay.
When Jesus, therefore, had received the salwine, he's on the cross. It's at the end of his 3 hours or so on the cross. He said this famous word in the Greek. Okay? The word in the Greek, he says, is way more poignant than the way it's translated in English. It's the word tetelestai. It's an economic term, and it means paid in full. He literally uses a Greek economic word and says paid in full. Why? What's paid in full? Sins. Okay? Tetelestai. It's finished. And he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. Who gave up his spirit? He did. Okay? No one took it from him. Okay? He gave it up.
He gave it up again. It's back to the point.
Right. Verse 31, the Jews, therefore, because it was the day of preparation, so that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, because remember, this is by 6 p.m., you got a problem here, because Sabbath starts Friday at 6. It says, so they had to hurry. For the Sabbath was a high day. They asked Pilate that the legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Because if you're on a cross and you're pushing yourself up with a spike that's in your ankles, like this, to breathe, if you break your legs, you can't do it, and you expire and suffocate very rapidly. Okay? Now remember, there's 3 there. Christ and the 2 thieves, or the 2 criminals. But the soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man, and also of the other man who was crucified with Christ. But coming to Jesus, when they saw that he had was already dead, they did not break his legs. Why didn't they do it? You know why? Because it prophesied that not a bone would be broken of his body. Okay? So one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, which is the fulfillment of another prophecy in Isaiah. And immediately there came out blood and water. And he who had seen has seen this borne witness, and his witness is true. In other words, John standing there with these women, okay, says, and he who has borne witness, and his witness is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you also may believe. For these things came to pass, that the scripture might be fulfilled, not a bone of him was broken. Okay? And again, another scripture, they shall look upon him who they pierced. Now, it's interesting. The first prophecy, not a bone of him shall be broken, was fulfilled at that time. But the second prophecy was not. They didn't understand who was pierced, that they pierced. They didn't understand who he really was.
You're talking about the Romans.
I'm talking about the Jews. Okay? They killed him, but they didn't understand who it was that they pierced. Now go back to Zechariah. Go back to Zechariah and read it again.
No, really, the person that was standing there and pierced him was not a Jew.
No, he was a Roman
It was
soldier.
a Roman soldier.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. Okay? But still, the Jews got Pilate to do this. The Jews didn't have the power to enact capital punishment themselves because they were under the control of the Romans. That's why Pilate washed his hands and said, do what you will. If you want him crucified, I'll have him crucified. Okay? So, in that sense, he was pierced by them. It's just that the agent was used of the Romans.
Just a little tiny
I
aside.
am confused.
When, and this really has, it's the same story that you're telling, but when I sang in the choir at Grace Brother, one of the Christmas programs was all the choir members and all the orchestra were, when they asked, who do you want us to kill? Jesus or Barabbas? And we were all to yell, Barabbas, Barabbas. And that was the most enlightening thing to me because of the crowd, how forceful a crowd can be.
Crowd mentality.
Yeah,
Yep.
right. Over and above the
Okay.
so-called authorities.
Right.
You know. That was really
Okay.
interesting.
What are you confused about? Go ahead, say it.
Can you repeat it?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Can you repeat it?
Okay. What I was saying in John 19 is that of these two prophecies,
One was fulfilled, the other.
the other was not at that time. It was not fulfilled. They did not understand and look upon whom they pierced. Okay?
They pierced, but they didn't know who they were piercing.
Yeah, look at the cross reference.
Okay, hang on. My Bible says here, and again another scripture says, they shall look on him whom they pierced.
Okay?
That's the same reason I asked it.
So what did not fulfill?
And that's the same question that I
Did they
asked,
look?
basically.
Yes, it did.
They saw a
Yeah.
man. Okay? They
Yeah.
saw a man. They
Not
saw
the Messiah.
someone that the Pharisees and the Sadducees conspired against. They saw him, but they didn't see who he really was. They didn't see that they crucified their own Messiah. They didn't see it. If they would have, they'd been saved at that point.
I understand, but maybe I just misinterpreted this. They shall look on him whom they pierced. It says look on him, not like understand who he
Yeah,
is.
they saw it, but they didn't understand.
Therefore, it did fulfill.
In 33 AD, they saw it happen, but they didn't really see who it was.
Okay,
Okay?
like heaven here.
The fulfillment is
Okay.
the understanding, not the piercing.
Exactly. So go back to the 10th verse of Zechariah 12, because this is where that quote comes from. In John 19, it comes right from this verse.
You don't understand what I'm asking, so that's
Okay.
I'm confused too.
It says,
You and I are on the same page.
Where are we now, John?
no, I'm back
Let's
to
have dinner together.
Zechariah.
and they will look upon me, Messiah, and will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. And they will weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. They will look upon me whom they have pierced. They look upon him here in the future, in Zechariah, this battle, they look upon him and they see Messiah. Their eyes are finally spiritually open. They see who he is. They see this is our Messiah who's raging, who's winning this battle for us. And what's their next reaction once they realize who he is?
They killed him.
They killed him.
We killed him.
Mm-hmm.
This is the man we crucified.
Mm-hmm.
This is the man we put to death. And they begin to weep and mourn because they realize what they did. They missed the boat. They missed the boat 2,000 years before. They didn't really see who it was.
So on your time that's up there on this, when do they actually do that then?
This is right after the Battle of Armageddon, at the Battle of Jerusalem. This is when they finally see it. Okay? Now, why do they mourn? I think they mourn for lots of reasons. The most obvious is they mourn because they finally realize what they did. Okay?
In other words, the notes in the wall and all that stuff doesn't have any meaning.
Right. They were missing
At all.
it. They just didn't see the big picture here at all. Secondly, think about it. If they're students, let's say, particularly conservative ones, that are students of Deuteronomy 28, what did they realize probably at that moment or what will they realize at that moment, about why for 2,000 years they've suffered.
How dumb am I?
What?
How dumb am I?
Exactly. We did this, and then we brought upon ourselves then the next 2,000 years of suffering that we've gone through.
Of which they're still doing.
Yeah.
And what a waste of time that they've spent
Yes.
their whole lives.
But because they were set aside,
Gentiles,
Gentiles came in.
Exactly. We're going to get there. Okay?
which I'm grateful for that.
Now.
Romans 9, 10, and 11.
Exactly. So let's do that. Let's turn now to Romans chapter 11, and let's see how Paul deals with this, because Paul is talking about the event that we're reading about in Zechariah 12, because he's read this verse clearly. He knows that it's a really big day. He's desperate about the Jews coming to know the Messiah like he came to know the Messiah himself. Right? Isn't it interesting? How did he come? He's blinded, and then it says the scales fell off his eyes, and he saw who Jesus was. Okay?
His veil was lifted.
His veil was lifted. So, let's read it. Oops, I'm not there. No. In Romans 11, starting in verse, what am I saying here? We start. Starting verse 11. Let's read what Paul says. I say then, he's talking about the Jews, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. But by their transgressions, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. That's exactly what Ann just said. The reason why we had the opportunity to become saved is because they rejected their Messiah. Otherwise, there never would have been another branch grafted into the olive tree. Okay? The olive tree has always been Israel. Make sense? It's all part of the plan. Verse 12, now if their transgression be the riches for the world, that is, to us, and their failure be riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? That's what we're reading right here. The day. Zechariah 12, verse 10. This is like going to be the greatest day. If 1948 was a great day for Israel to be back in the land, this is a way bigger day.
So
For them
they
to
stand there like deer in headlights and say,
oh my gosh, what have we done? What have we done?
They may say, oh my God.
Yeah.
They literally may say that.
And remember, it says here, they mourn. And we're going to go into the mourning here in a minute, okay? He says, verse 12, but I'm speaking to you who are Gentiles, inasmuch as that I am the apostle to the Gentiles. And then let me drop down to verse 15. For if their rejection be the reconciliation of the world, in other words, because they rejected him, forgiveness of sins was given to the world, to the Gentile world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? This dead olive tree, this moment that we're reading about in Zechariah 12:10 will suddenly become spiritually alive for the first time. They'll be spiritually alive. And then he gives another analogy. And if the first piece of dough be holy, the lump also. If the root be holy, for the branches are too. For if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive were grafted in among them, so you're grafted into this tree called Israel, he says, and become partaker of them, the rich root of the olive tree. Don't be arrogant towards the branches, but if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. All the original promises were to Israel, not to the church. This is why it's such foolishness when people say that somehow at the point at which Pentecost occurred, Israel just lost all of its meaning, it lost all of its purpose, it rejected its Messiah, it was just put aside. Hope you guys have a good time. Don't know what your future is. Do you realize how big a part of the church teaches that?
Yeah.
A huge portion says that Israel was replaced by the church. That is complete foolishness. Israel's never replaced by the church. The church has its meaning because of Israel's rejection of their Messiah.
Who really loves believing that? The Arabs.
Oh, of
Arab
course.
Christians.
Absolutely. They'll never accept what we just read here. Go ahead, Norm.
Well, I was going to ask you the question in relationship to the churches that you're talking about. Don't you have to go further back in that and say that what's being taught is coming out of the schools that they were taught in?
Yes.
Whoever's the minister?
Yes.
And so then how do you fix that mess? It's
Well,
not fixable.
you don't. You
Only
don't.
the Holy Spirit
Yeah,
can do it.
you don't in the sense that you can't go back in history and correct all the seminary training and the seminary teaching and all. But I'm just telling you, if you start to go, if you want to do an interesting search, do a search on the different denominations and go through and ask, what is their view of Israel and the church? What's the future of Israel in their mind? Okay? I mean, Pam, who's not sitting here right now, has a church group that basically says that 70 AD, everything just stopped. I mean, do you know how many verses in the Old Testament and how many prophets you have to cut out to believe that?
Most of the book.
you have to just blindly eliminate a massive amount of prophetic teaching to take that position, and yet it's the vast minority teach what we're talking about right now.
Well, it fits because in one of the churches that I attended and was involved with, Kath knows, that the pastor at that time taught things on that basis. You remember that, Kathy? You don't remember that?
You know?
You don't remember that part of it? Okay. We'll talk about it.
All right. Now,
You will remember it.
let me
We'll remember that.
Well, twist your arm.
let me drop down to verse 24 of Romans to finish this off of Romans 11. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more shall these who are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? In other words, how much more will Israel, being the real root, the original olive tree, be enlivened and grow its own branches once it comes to faith? Okay? This is why, if you haven't figured it out, the 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth is a reign from Israel. Okay? The world will be, in the 1,000-year reign of Christ, Israel-centric. It'll all be about Israel and Jerusalem, and all the nations will have to comply with it.
So
All right?
where are the Jews going to be when this happens? Are they going to be at Petra?
No. They're going to be, well,
That's an interesting question.
some of them will be at Petra. You're right.
Petra.
Okay? Some of them will be at Petra. But of those that live in Jerusalem,
The ones
okay,
that are left.
the ones that are left, they will be experiencing this. Okay?
They'll be coming from the Mount Olives.
Because he'll come to the Mount of Olives, go down the valley, come up the other side, go through the gate,
Right.
the eastern gate.
Then he goes to Petra.
No. Goes to Petra first. He goes
Oh,
to
that's right.
Armageddon
We had that argument
second,
last week.
and he goes to the Mount of Olives third.
But he had blood on him when he went to Petra.
He sure did, because that's where he starts the battle against Armageddon in the southern end and moves north up the valley. That's why he wears robe. Isaiah 63. He wears robes of red. We've read that verse a number of times. All right, so.
So these will be the worshiping Jews that go into the millennial reign, 1,000 years,
Yes.
because they'll still be alive.
And whatever Gentiles survive.
Then their future offspring will be probably the ones that will turn bad because
1,000 years later.
1,000 years.
A long, long time. Okay, so let's read verse 25. For I do not want you to be uninformed of the mystery lest you be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come. In other words, when this happens, the Gentile world, the Gentile-dominated world is done. And the Israel-dominated world starts.
Well, most people interpret this that it's the last of the Gentiles will become Christians.
Good luck. I think that's a real problematic interpretation.
I'm just saying that's the way most people look at it.
I know, but it's a problematic interpretation. And in the context, it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah,
Because
it
look,
doesn't make sense to me either.
Yeah.
Because you can only squeeze one more in.
Yeah.
Okay, can you two both define that even more?
He's saying that there is some people interpret the verse we just read saying that this is the day when the last Gentile person in the church apparently becomes saved, and the door is closed to Gentiles. But that can't be true, because when you read in Isaiah, there are plenty of believing Gentiles in the 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of them that worship the Lord. Okay? All right? I think the correct interpretation is, personally, I believe, is the one I just gave you, and that is the fullness of the Gentiles has come means the Gentile-dominated world, currently at this time being led by Antichrist and his troops, is done. Done. Okay? A new era is beginning.
And
A new era.
Gentile-led.
And it will not be
Jewish.
Gentile-led, it will be Jewish-led, with Messiah the King ruling in Jerusalem. It's going to be, think about it, it's going to be an unbelievable transformation. All of a sudden, everything that we've known for thousands of years about a Gentile-led world stops. And all of a sudden God says, the nations aren't going to run it anymore this way. Psalm 2. Why do you nations rebel against your Lord? They aren't going to rebel anymore. They aren't going to rebel. Okay? Besides,
Russia taxes, and we.
yeah, well, I know, but that seems to be the implication among many nations.
Well, besides that, the Gentiles will have the veil put over their eyes at that point in time.
Go on. How do you mean that?
Because the rapture will have taken place, and all the true believing Christians will be in heaven.
Yes.
Thus, who's left to spread the gospel?
Well,
other than the true prophets, the angel that's flying around,
right.
And
and
144,000.
144,000.
There's still plenty of ways in which they can know.
I'm not saying that there's not
Yeah.
plenty of ways. I'm just saying that the likelihood is less.
Probably. Plus, there's a whole lot of bad stuff going on.
Right.
Now, let's get to this morning so we can finish off, okay? M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. I'm not going to talk till the morning. That's not what I said. I know I saw fear in your eyes. So, all
Are
right.
you going to review this type of information when we start next week?
I can.
You should.
Okay, this is your first shot at it. No. So let's
No, it takes 2 or 3 times.
let's go back. It's a lot of information, and we're pulling together a lot of things into this final epic chapter that's occurring in Earth history. So back to Zechariah 12, and let's take this morning thing. It says that in that day there will be great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. Well, what's that all about? Well, that is a very famous event which occurred in ancient Israel that the Jews knew about and celebrated in a mourning sense. Go to 2 Chronicles 35. If you were a good, conservative, Hasidic Jew and you read that passage, you go, oh, I remember that. 2 Chronicles 35. And we will look starting at verse 20. This is a story about one of the few good kings, okay, called Josiah. He was a king that believed in the Lord, did lots of reformations, got rid of the idols, brought the people back to proper worship, yada, 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 and all those good things. And
He was young when
yes, he was. He was. So, starting in verse 20, it says, after all this, when Josiah had set the temple in order, Necho, the king of Egypt, came to make war at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out to engage him. Okay? Necho is a strange word for Pharaoh, isn't it?
Unbelievably strange.
It is. Actually, what you find is that apparently, when you go through archaeology and history, he was an Assyrian that actually gained the throne temporarily for a short period of time of Egypt.
Really?
Yeah. It's a very interesting. We're not going to go down that rabbit trail tonight.
You know what I was thinking.
I know. All right. And it says, but Necho sent messengers to him, saying, what have we to do with each other, O king of Judah? I am not coming against you today, but against the house with which I am at war. And he says, and God has, this is interesting, this is this pagan king, and God has ordered me to hurry. Stop for your own sake from interfering with God, who is with me, that he may not destroy you. Now, did he get a vision at night? We don't know. But he got some real specific information about.
Well, remember about Alexander the Great?
Oh yeah,
story.
oh yeah. He got a vision, which told him. Well, it's interesting. Yeah.
Who was he going after? Was he going after Judah at that time?
Necho, he was. There was a battle between, I believe, the Assyrians and the Egyptians. I believe it was. Hold that in quotes there. I'd have to go back and look more carefully. But so it's really interesting that God apparently told this odd Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about Josiah, and warned him, don't do this. Don't do this. However, Josiah would not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to make war with him. Nor did he listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but came to make war on. And it is interesting. Where does he make? Where's the battle occur?
Megiddo.
At Megiddo. Armageddon. Except it's not the final Armageddon. It's another one. Okay? Same place. By the way, it's also called the Valley of Jezreel. That's its more ancient term. You know what the word Jezreel means? Decision. In other words, everything will be decided one day at Armageddon. The Valley of Decision. Interesting, God named it that. And the archers shot King Josiah. And the king said to his servants, take me away, for I'm badly wounded. So his servants took him out of the chariot and carried him to the second chariot which he had, and brought him to Jerusalem, where he died and was buried in the tombs of his fathers. And all Judah and Jerusalem mourned Josiah. That's why it's referred to here in Zechariah. It's a very famous event in Jewish history where the good King Josiah tragically died because he disobeyed, but he died. And they had enormous, if you go through the writings of the Jews, they had days and days and days of mourning about his loss. Okay? Matter of fact, look at verse 25. Then Jeremiah, who was then a prophet, chanted a lament for Josiah. And all the male and female singers speak about Josiah and their lamentations to this day. See how it became a tradition? And they made an ordinance in Israel. Behold, they are also written in the book of Lamentations, where you'll find reference also to this. And it talks about the rest of the deeds of Josiah. So that's what's being referred to here.
What language is this remnant? I mean, why didn't they just say Josiah?
Because it's a place.
Oh, it's a place.
It's a place. It's a place. It's about 4 miles south of the central part of the valley there. It's a little town.
Okay.
This is where he got shot, at this place.
And he did that
He got
because he
shot.
disobeyed.
By an arrow.
Okay.
He disobeyed God.
Yep, he did. Although he obeyed in many ways, he didn't obey at this point. It cost him his life. Okay? Now, so all Israel it says, in that same way in which Israel mourned desperately for the loss of Josiah, all Israel will mourn even more when they realize that they killed Messiah on the cross. Okay? They'll mourn and mourn and mourn. And here's how... Yes, mourning. You now heard mourning.
Well said.
Okay? It says...
Politician.
Yes, yes. It says, here's how they'll mourn. Let's read it. It says, and the land will mourn, every family by itself. In other words, it won't just be a group thing. It will be very individual. Everyone will see the sense of sadness about realizing who Messiah is that was crucified. And it says, and the land will mourn, every family by itself. The family of the house of David by itself. So, start out with who was the king. The great and the powerful will mourn in Israel. Okay, and their wives by themselves. And
Why are the wives by themselves?
I'll tell you why I think, in a minute, why I think that's true.
Okay.
I'll give you my opinion of why I think it's true, okay? Because I've struggled with that one myself, Ian.
Well, it's said several times.
Yeah. And the family of the house of Nathan by himself. So now we have a king. And now we have the prophet Nathan, who was prophet during David's day. Okay? Who confronted David on multiple occasions. Okay? And then it says, in the family of the house of Nathan by itself, and their wives by themselves, in the family of the house of Levi. So you have the king, you have the prophet, you have the priest. Okay? Alright? That's why I think this is what is meant. Now, why is that important? Well, we've already talked about that, because I'm not going to go back there, but in Zechariah 6, we have, remember, what's his name?
You're asking us.
Just a second. I'll find his name. Joshua. Remember, they take Joshua and they make a special crown for him, and they take him, and he's a prophet, and he's a priest, and then they put this king's crown on him. And it's like, everybody that knew, you don't mix the offices like this. Go, ooh, okay. But God said, do this. In the same way, it's recognizing these three offices here in all these groups that mourn. Right? And then it says, and then even the family of the Shemites by itself, if you go back, you don't have to look here, but if you really want to, you can go to Numbers 3:18 and look at who the Shemites were. They were a very small subfamily of the Levites. So they were also a group of, let's call them your everyday priests. That's the easy way to put it, okay? Now, here's why I think the mourning of the wives is emphasized. Turn to Jeremiah 9.
Boy, something smells good.
Now,
Where'd you say?
Jeremiah 9. This is an example of how, if you ask yourself a question, why is this true, you're going to end up in a rabbit trail. So here was my rabbit trail on this one. Jeremiah 9, starting in verse 17. Okay? Thus says the Lord of hosts, consider and call for the mourning women, that they may come, and send for the wailing women, that they may come. And let them make haste and come up, take a wailing for us, that our eyes may shed tears, and our eyelids flow with water. For a voice was wailing, it is heard in Zion, how we are ruined. We are put to great shame, for we have left the land, because they have cast down our dwellings. So, and then it even says in 20, and now hear the word of the Lord, O you women, and let your ear receive the voice of the Lord, O you daughters of wailing. So there's a tradition that was started about formal wailing, the wailing of women. Now, if you look at Matthew 9:23, go to Matthew, let's finish this off. If you go to Matthew 9, all the way into the New Testament, you'll see a reference to this type of thing.
This when the little girl is dead?
Yep. And Jesus turning and seeing, verse 22, and Jesus turning and seeing her said, daughter, they said, she's dead. Don't bother trying to do anything. She's dead. And it says, he turns and says to her, daughter, take courage. Your faith has made you well. And at once the woman was made well. And when Jesus came out of this official's house, this guy that had this I believe this 12-year-old child, was it a 12-year-old child?
I think so.
No.
Says up above, well, hemorrhage for 12 years.
But at any rate, anyway, let's not go into all that because I want to finish this off. But anyway, he began to say, verse 23, when Jesus came into the official's house, he saw the flute players in the crowd in noisy disorder. This was the tradition we just read about here of the women and the flute players. There was a tradition, even the poor were kind of required in a funeral to at least hire a couple flute players and hire a couple women that would officially weep and wail. This is a tradition of Jewish funerals.
Can you do that?
Weep and wail.
I want to hear the wailing.
Okay? Now, turn lastly to Matthew 27, since you're in Matthew 9. And go to Matthew 27. And we're going to look at verses 55 and 56. You there? Mm-hmm. And many women, this is at Christ's crucifixion. Okay? At the very end, he's died. And many women were there looking on from a distance, who had followed him from Galilee, Jesus of Galilee, ministering to him. And among those were Mary Magdalene, along with Mary, the mother of James, and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So a lot of women followed his ministry. As a matter of fact, at his crucifixion, remember, the disciples split and ran away, but the women stayed. Okay? And what?
Shows you who's tough.
It shows you stuff. And one last thing, I'm going to take you to John chapter 20.
It was only John who left, right? John who stayed.
I think John stayed, yes. I'm going to go to John chapter 20.
He was supposed to take care of Mary.
Yes.
Jesus and other.
Starting in verse 11. This is after he's arisen. But Mary was standing outside the tomb, weeping. And so as she wept, she stooped and looked in the tomb, and she beheld two angels in white sitting, one at his head and one at his feet, where the body of Jesus had been lying. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've laid him." I think this might be a rather prophetic image, and why it's repeated 3 times. Okay? And the women and the wives separately. Because I think it may have been prophetic in relationship to what was the death of Messiah.
But didn't angels know what was going on?
Yeah, they did. But in essence, they're saying, okay, you're weeping. Do you not understand what's happened? Because from their standpoint, they go, he isn't dead. He's arisen. Mm-hmm. But from their standpoint, they're saying, well, we just saw him die 3 days earlier.
Mm-hmm. So the angels are actually the ones that started to educate them as to what, okay.
Mm-hmm. All right. So here's the tradition of women weeping. And I think that's why it's said, I think it was said 3 times in that passage in Zechariah. So that finishes the 12th chapter.
Really? You actually think
But
so?
it emphasizes that not only women were with him, but also men.
True. But there was a special ministry of women weeping, a special importance of women weeping.
But
Going back,
specific day, even men will be crying.
that's true. Everyone, every family, every person, from the great to the small, will mourn. That's what it's telling us. It's a beautiful picture of Jerusalem, isn't it? So, now we will start in chapter 13. We've got 2 chapters left to finish off this. Are you following me? It's complicated, isn't it?
Very.
It is. It is not an easy
I'll
book.
forward to you tomorrow morning.
Next time I want you to pick something real easy.
Yes. Okay. Mikey, if you're
By
still...
the way, I heard on the news that the Israelis and Trump and the Palestinians have come to an agreement to build a
Water line.
130-mile water line from Jordan, from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea.
Oh, from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea. Wow. Right